All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I think we got off to a really wonderful start with both our congressional speakers and to hear Penny Pritzker, who has a very important role in the United States and I think filling a very important hole in our political economy and our policy toward Ukraine. This conversation is going to be an interesting one. This is not the first time we've had a conversation about how to invest in Ukraine. And I know this cast of characters has been on the stage with me before, but it's an important conversation. And just to frame this, I went back and pulled World Bank data between 2011 and 2021 before the war began. And average FDI into Ukraine over that period was $4 billion. So if the range is somewhere between $350 to $750 billion to rebuild Ukraine, we could be talking about 185 years at that pace. We don't have that time. This isn't a charity. It's a business case. I think Sergey said that very clearly this morning. But we also know that because of COVID, because of the war, and because of climate, there is just not enough public money, official development aid available to fill that gap. And we really are going to have to rely outsized on the private sector and the private sector coming into Ukraine to help us build back better. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And since some things have happened and some things haven't happened, I want to talk about who's investing now in Ukraine and why, maybe who's not investing in Ukraine and why. And then because we have a lot of policymakers in the room, I'd like some advice from my panelists about what kind of policy advice would we give the U.S. government and what changes would we like to see so we increase more and more of that investment from the U.S. So let me start first with my panel. So I'm very pleased to say that you guys probably all know Lena, but Lena Kazarny is the founding partner and CEO of Horizon Capital. It is one of the oldest and largest PE firms in Ukraine today. Lena's on the ground. She has $1.4 billion of assets under management and is in the process of deploying her fourth fund, which she raised during the war. My second speaker is Michael Polsky, who for many of you probably doesn't need an introduction either, but he is the founder and CEO of Invenergy, and it's a company that develops, acquires, and operates energy assets around the world, and he has an emphasis on renewable energy. My third speaker, I think, is probably well known to the audience too, Agnes Dasowicz, who is now the COO of the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. Prior to that, she worked with the small enterprise funds and has a renowned reputation both as a public policymaker as well as an investor in development. And finally, coming to us from Europe, I have Tomas Achkowicz, who is the partner at Deloitte covering Central Europe, but also one of the global leaders in the firm working on their Ukraine strategy. So brings a very interesting perspective and blend. Lena, I want to start with you. You are the only panelist on the ground. You are also the co-chair of AmCham, who recently did a quite interesting study, and some of the findings I thought were interesting. So between the people that were mildly optimistic and optimistic, 78% of the business people in Ukraine said that the economy will turn positive in 2024. But only 38% of them were positive on the overall environment. So sitting on the ground today, what's it like 18 months into the war?
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'm glad you also touched on AmCham because in addition to being CEO of Horizon, I'm very proud to be chair of the board of American Chamber of Commerce. We've got Andy Hunded here, President, Vice President Tatiana, and Alex McWhorter from Citi as well. So we have a nice big contingent. Look, I just want to paint what it looks like on the ground. I mean, let's never forget that Ukrainians are living under, if we look at 31,000 air raid sirens, 5,200 ballistic and cruise missile attacks, 3,500 airstrikes, and over 2,000 drone strikes. And yet every single day, people get up, they go to work, they open up their factories, they open up the coffee shops, they open up the restaurants, and they just get down to business. And that's the environment, and that's when we talk about resilience. I mean, that's the kind of resilience you're talking about. So what is it like on the ground? It's inspiring. And everyone will tell you that it's inspiring seeing what Ukrainians are doing and seeing what Ukrainians have done. At AmCham, you've got 600 members. And those stats that you said were so interesting, but what I really found interesting was that over 84% of companies are fully operational. Also, when we look at the results for companies, when we look at 2023, 72% are going to meet or exceed their planned results for 2023. Yeah, I think that's pretty incredible. So you see this, this ongoing resilience. We see this in the portfolio. As you mentioned, we did raise a fund. It's the largest fund for Ukraine since the full-fledged invasion. We wouldn't have been able to do it without many of the folks sitting on this panel. Thank you so much to DFC. Thank you, Stephanie, IFC. You started this before your shift over to Citi. But we felt very strongly that we need to make sure that there's capital on the ground now, not when the war is over, no, in some post-war recovery. Ukrainians are running their businesses, and when you have interest rates at about 25% for hryvnia, you need equity investment, growth capital into these companies to ensure that they keep on operating. And I think you'll be surprised at some of the, if I try to bring a real-life example. Imagine a retail operation across the entire country. And before the full-fledged invasion, they have 863 stores, mainly in south and eastern Ukraine. It falls to 636 after February 24th because almost more than 100 stores are shuttered or they're in occupied territory, et cetera. They're at 1,150 stores today. They're opening a store every 17 hours. How is that possible? Because you've got that resilience. It is a huge country. It's operating. People need to bank. They're on the internet. Internet has never gone down. So, Stephanie, look, I want this war to end. We all do. And we are so grateful for the military aid, so grateful for the financial aid. Everyone will say that. At the same time, I'm very grateful to both the military servicemen who ensure that we can still operate our businesses every single day, and I'm very grateful to those in the business community who are paying taxes. If we look at the 2022 budget sources, 43% is taxes, 22% is foreign aid. So folks are paying their taxes. Those tax revenues are continuing to increase, went up 10% year on year in Q1 2023, because people feel it's their patriotic duty. They know that that money goes to military wages. So it's a difficult situation, Stephanie, on the ground, but at the same time, it's resilient and optimistic, and folks are just getting it done.
So, Lena, that's why I wanted to start with you. I knew you would be an optimist, but let me just follow up. So we heard a little bit this morning about right shoring. Where else are you seeing investment opportunities for your fund?
We're starting with tech. So over the years, we are the largest tech investor in the country in digital services and product platforms. We're starting with tech. We're starting because when we look at our fund, we're very fortunate that with the amount that was raised so far, $254 million, we really had the backing of international financial institutions, bilateral institutions who got us to that point. But we also very much want to bring private investors in. So we will hit $300 million this month. It will end up 80-20 in terms of public and private, which actually I think is pretty impressive given we're calling the money now and investing it now. We've already done one investment. We'll hit 5 by the end of the year. We'll put 80 million of that 300 million to work this year. So when you look at the rebuild, everyone is projecting 2/3 public, 1/3 private. And here we have a real case where it's 80-20 already and money's being dispersed right now. Where we see opportunities beyond tech, of course, and that's a growing industry, are in the export-oriented sectors. So in our pipeline, light manufacturing, food and agro, food processing, higher up the value chain. What we also see is where there's dispersed infrastructure, okay? Understandably, right now, no one is safe from a rocket hitting a plant. If you have one asset, one major large asset that is worth billions of dollars, it's a difficult question to build that right now from scratch. But if you have retail operations, telecom, if you've got dispersed infrastructure throughout the country, then you see that those kinds of investors are comfortable continuing to invest because they're seeing that the growth in our portfolio, we have 40% growth in revenue across the companies. They see that the growth can outpace any kind of losses.
Very interesting. So, Michael, I want to turn to you. You're a native Ukrainian, born there, immigrated to the United States, have built an incredible infrastructure company, really investing in energy all around the world. You haven't yet invested in Ukraine. Why not?
Obviously, as Lena just mentioned, energy is a different area. It's not a retail business. It's a long-term investment. You want to make sure that when you invest, and as Secretary Pritzker mentioned, it's going to be a business case. You don't just invest as a charity, as a business. You invest as a business. So I always like to say you have to have enabling conditions. You don't just invest thinking, I'll see what's going to happen. You have to have enabling conditions. And again, Special Envoy Pritzker mentioned this, that you have to have rule of law, you have to have economics preconditions, you have to have sanctity of contracts, you have to have all these things. You can't just wait and beg to be paid. So before the war, based on at least our assessment, what was the situation in Ukraine versus opportunities elsewhere, we just felt that opportunities elsewhere were more attractive because we are a larger company now, we operate at scale, we're not just one project at a time, so we had to look where there is sufficient conditions for us to deploy money. We invested in El Salvador $1 billion in the largest infrastructure investment because we felt that there are conditions there, and so far everything working. So that's how we assess. Again, we are business, but we're also private business. I always like to say we eat what we kill. If we invest and we don't get revenues, we are dead.
So we had a very interesting prep call where first we talked about, what are those conditions? And I think Sergey mentioned a few of the advantages that Ukraine is putting out there today, tax incentives to try to get more and more investment coming in. But you made a really interesting observation, which is we can't do this project by project. We really have to start thinking far more programmatically and on platform levels in order to make the investments happen in Ukraine. Can you kind of take the audience through that thinking?
We face really unprecedented situation. We have to rebuild the country, in essence. Country of 40 million people. I don't say it's from scratch, but really from at least the beginning, okay? And we got to rethink certain things that maybe were working before the war now because of sort of resilience and so on. We have to look differently. So historically what happened is we were building a project. There is a project, people go, try to develop, finance, may take a few years, they go to DFC, IFC, EBRD, wait for a long time, they get approval, and maybe move forward. As you mentioned in your presentation, at $4 billion a year, it will take probably lifetime of 10 generations to rebuild the country. We can afford this. So we have to really, and we're talking numbers, 400 billion or 500 billion, $1 trillion, and energy is crucial field. You can't say, I'm going to build everything and energy comes last because it takes a long time, because it's a fundamental. Without energy, without electricity, you can't rely on anything, particularly it's a northern country and need heating as well. So, you have to look at the programmatic approach. Programmatic approach is meaning not one at a time. And by the way, in the United States with IRA and everything, we have created programmatic approach. We're not doing one at a time. So, and everybody has to realize this. And one at a time, so it's got to be a program. And also programs, got to be sectorial programs. Because as Lena mentioned, energy is not a retail store. It's not as dispersed. You can't rely on experts for revenue. You have to rely on the domestic payments in a way. So you have to look sector by sector and create sectorial approach. Energy is different. To have even quick win in energy, you can't, because you got to create conditions for everybody to be able. You can't just create conditions for one project and then other projects don't have conditions. So if you have sanctity of contracts, it's got to be for everybody. You have to have payment guarantee, got to be for everybody. You got to have insurance. You can't just say, I give this project everything, but our next project, I don't know whether they get anything. So we got to be realistic about that. That's another thing. We have to prioritize things. We can't rebuild the country. We can't have on immediate needs. We got to prioritize things, prioritize technologies. I mean, obviously, renewables, you can't compare it to nuclear. Nuclear take decades to do. Renewables could be done soon. So we got to look at this realistically. And I know there are representatives here from multilaterals. They also have to change their approach. They have to look at the programs. Maybe multilaterals can go on a tour and talk to the investor and see what investors need to rebuild Ukraine. It will be helpful too. So we are extremely interested to go back to Ukraine, to help. We have a lot of experience. But again, just like anybody else, it's got to be a business for us.
Thank you. And I was actually encouraged to hear we're looking at SMRs. That might be a type of energy technology that could move more rapidly. But Agnes, I want to turn to you now. You are an investor in Ukraine. You have a position in Horizon Capital, and we're really glad to see that. But I'd like to get your reaction to this idea of, are there ways for us to think programmatically? Can we take sponsors and clear them and give them lines of credit that are much longer that they could draw and disperse more rapidly? And if not, how else could DFC speed up the process of investing now? But also, it's a marathon. It's not just a sprint. So how do we get Olympic-type marathon runners as our investors?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting us to be here. We're obviously open in Ukraine and very, very happy to meet with anyone who's interested in doing business with us. DFC and previously our predecessor organization, OPEC, have been open in Ukraine since independence, and we currently have a portfolio of about $800 million, and we continue to look for more projects. So we don't feel like, yes, there's a lot of planning that's needed, but frankly, there are investable projects there, and we're pursuing them, and we're placing investment into those projects now. I do agree with prioritization, and we have prioritized Ukraine quite a bit. Our CEO, Nathan, has been to the country 3 times in the last year, really to show our unwavering commitment to the country and to the current climate that Lena just really described. We've seen that ourselves. It's incredible. Businesses are growing, they're investing, commerce is happening. So we're really focused on the now and finding out how we can do that more quickly and efficiently is on top of our agenda. I think Lena will attest to the fact that our investment in Horizon was very quick. It was not a marathon. It was really a sprint. And we were able to do that because of the consistent message that we want to send, that we are open there, we want to support investments, and of course, we're very, very focused on investments that are transparent, that fit American values, and that really support the people and the communities of Ukraine. That's very important to us. So we do feel there are lots of opportunities. The main tool that we are using and that we see most in demand is our political risk insurance. That is about 50% of our portfolio there, and we're seeing an increased demand. This is really insurance against expropriation, as well as non-payment of government contracts and so on. And basically, most investors, especially investors from outside of Ukraine, really find some comfort with a U.S. investor guaranteeing these types of, or really mitigating those types of risks for them in Ukraine as the war continues. We all hope that the war will end, but like I was saying, we do need planning, but we really need investment now because we're very happy with our portfolio and it's performing quite well.
I was actually shocked to hear one of the congressmen say the war may go on for another 5 or 6 years this morning. That was not very uplifting. But Agnes, I want to follow up because I think the slides that we saw from Ukraine Invest were quite interesting. $182 billion of U.S. spend on the military so far to bring us this far in the war. $1.3 billion of inbound direct investment from the U.S. That's a huge gap. And I think when we come to Tomasz, we're going to see the gap might be in the opposite direction. What would you say to policymakers? What requests would you have to say, okay, what do we need to actually leverage that $82 billion so that it is good for U.S. investment into Ukraine? And maybe what do you want from the business community? What do you need us to be telling policymakers so that we can level that playing field?
So I think what's really key is that, as I mentioned, first of all, our main mission is to catalyze private investment. So every time we invest, we need to have a private sector partner. So we are constantly looking for businesses, Ukrainian businesses, European businesses, American businesses, who we can support, and we have supported them in the past. But we need to have really two things, and all investors need this. One is a transparent, stable regulatory regime. I think Michael will agree with this. Investors like, in my experience, investing all over the world, including in Eastern Europe, countries that had a very stable regulatory, transparent regulatory regime attracted lots of international investment. Because in my experience, it's not that investors don't like regulations, they just really would like to understand them and know that they won't change in the last minute. Mm-hmm. So I think we really applaud President Zelensky's commitment to the anti-corruption agenda, and that is an amazing, amazing step. We really need just transparency to continue, for investors to understand that once they come in, we will really be able to support them. Our investments are very long-term. We do, on a regular basis, 15 to 20-year loans. So in general, we're not afraid of long-term. We want to be a long-term partner, but everyone, including us, really need to have that playing field that is very transparent and a runway that we can see.
We're going to come back to transparency later, but Tomasz, I want to turn to you. So when the war started, I think the political talk was the U.S. will pay for the war and Europe will pay for the reconstruction. So you're sitting in Central Europe, you're in Poland, but you see most of the Central European companies. Who's investing in Ukraine? Are you actually seeing them begin to make investment?
Thank you, Stephanie, for inviting us to this panel. Deloitte is in Ukraine for 30 years, and now we have a global task force that will help rebuild Ukraine, help donor agencies, government of Ukraine, and private businesses to invest and build a modern, strong European economy. The same economy that you see now, in Poland, Romania, Czech Republic, and that's how Central European and Western European companies who often operate through Poland, Czech Republic look at Ukraine. It's going to be next Central Europe, next engine, big economy, very diversified economy, the economy that has, it's not going to be economy that only will take money from outside of Ukraine, but it will have enough dynamics to be very interesting economy that will then, will be another kind of engine for European growth, just like you've seen in Poland and Czech Republic and Romania, other Central European companies. That's how the boards in Europe look at it. Now it depends what the board is. Now, if you're closer to the Ukrainian border, if you're in Poland or Czech Republic, you're more kind of acquainted with Ukraine. You've probably invested in Ukraine. You have the operations in Ukraine, and you are willing to invest. So extend your facility, rebuild, whatever was destroyed, because demand is there. And the business makes sense for the internal market, but also for European markets, as well as Kazakhstan, Turkey, and other countries out in the Asia. So that's how they look at it. And the further west you are, the more concerned and more maybe risk averse they are.
So do you actually see them relying on their national development banks for support into Ukraine today? So SECO, DEG, some of the Mittelstand companies that are moving?
Exactly. So that's critical. The KUKE and the export sort of financing insurance agencies will play a key role in first ensuring the trade and then the investments. Unfortunately, those budgets are at the moment small. These are, $30, $50 million facilities which are available, they need to be much bigger in order to help those companies to be more brave in Ukraine.
Great. So now I think we've set the scene. It's obviously much more active in Ukraine than we see from U.S. press. In our prep call, we all touched on human capital, and having sat through many of these conversations, it's not something that we talk a lot about. So I want to pivot to human capital. 6.2 million Ukrainians officially out of the country, probably an underestimate. Millions of people displaced. Tomasz, when we talked, you were saying you would think it's going to be really difficult to get Ukrainians back to Ukraine, and especially wearing kind of a Polish view. Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, I mean, a lot of Ukrainians left the country. Well, they were in Poland before, and they were welcome because they're hard-working people, and they integrate easily into Polish society. The kids, when they go to school, they pick up language like this. I mean, we have friends who. A kid went to school for 3 months and speaks Polish fluently. So they already integrated. They're in the European Union. It's safe. And at the same time, you're close enough, so if you need to go back, you're close enough. So now a lot of Ukrainians are leaving for Germany because of the better economics. It will be extremely difficult, the longer the war lasts, to get these people back. For a number of reasons. Kids went to school, you have a good job. And so there needs to be a very good program that will attract Ukrainians back. Maybe also some sort of immigration policy to help grow the population. Private sector will also have to play a vital role, make sure that people who come back, they get proper training, or people who come back from the front lines, they need to be retooled. So, the government, international agencies, EU also will have to provide funds to private businesses, and private businesses. This will be the really show, how responsible you are towards your employees. So, retrain them and provide them with a safe working environment.
Yeah, so a lot of World Bank literature actually speaks kind of post-conflict and fragility. You need to create jobs for stability. So Michael, you were, I think, really worried too that if you were to invest in Ukraine, there's not enough boots on the ground to actually run your operation. That AmCham study that we were talking about earlier said that 43% of the CEOs that filled out the survey said they were really worried about attracting and retaining talent. Where do you think the Ukrainians are today that you would want to be working with you in Ukraine? Are they in the U.S.?
First of all, I am of Ukrainian descent, and by the way, talking human capital, I tell people I came here without language, without connections, without any money, but I had a good education. I went to Polytechnic Institute, I knew math, I knew formulas, and that's why I'm sitting here today, because of my education. So it's a very educated society. Certainly, human capital is the key, and human capital on the ground, but I do believe that it will be good opportunities for people to work in interesting situation. Some people will come back. Not everyone, because of certain circumstances, but people generally follow the opportunities, and if there is a good business to do in Ukraine, good jobs, because generally when Ukrainians immigrate or leave, a lot of them in the United States, generally they're not as fluent in the language. It's much more difficult to start here and grow and go back and have better job opportunities, and more impactful is important. So I feel it's sort of a chicken and egg situation, but if business start growing in Ukraine, a lot of people will come back because of opportunities. And frankly, they understand that life in the West, maybe Poland is a little bit different because of, similar societies and life's easier to assimilate. They find that Western country is not as easy to assimilate. And they understand that grass may be not as green as they would have thought coming here. So I think they'll be happy to come back.
So Lynn, I want to turn to you. You actually have staff on the ground today, incredibly resilient, very dedicated and loyal to their country and to Horizon. And you really leverage the skill sets from what I believe is a fairly well-educated citizenship. So talk to me a little bit about your view on human capital in Ukraine, short-term and long-term.
Sure. I have, I guess, a bit of a different view. And I'll start off with what President Zelensky said when he took office. And I remember these words in Parliament. And he said, he talked about Ukraine being 65 million people strong. And he was including the diaspora. He was including the people in Ukraine and the people outside of Ukraine. So at that point, it was 45 and 20. Now it may be 40 and 25. But those people are contributing immensely to the Ukrainian economy. These folks are sending home to Ukraine 1 to 2 billion a month. So, you know, let's look at Canada, neighbor to the north. Never had more than 40 million people, one of the largest countries in the world, and a great economy. So I don't think we need to be this fixated on this. I think we need to recognize that there are at least 65 million Ukrainian strong family who are very active in their communities across the globe, who are contributing to Europe, who are contributing to the US, who are working hard, sending money home. If you look at the streets of Kyiv, the traffic jams are as bad as they were before. I mean, what it feels like is that many people from other cities have come to Kyiv. It's a wonderful vibe. It's a great energy. And you certainly, anecdotally, in talking to people, I don't think that many people won't come home. I mean, I think that 20, 30%, potentially those where the entire family has left, understandably. But what we see is that many of the folks outside of Ukraine are women with young children. Who would want their young children to be subjected to 31,000 air raid sirens that we've seen across the country? You know, in Kyiv alone, if you add up all the air raid sirens since February 24th, it's 30 full days. Imagine 30 full days of air raid sirens. Of course, as a mother, as a family member, you want your children to go to school in a different country, and that's what we've seen with some of the people who are abroad. But they want to come home. They want to rejoin bring their family together in Ukraine. And you see that this sense in Kyiv, especially, Kyiv feels like the safest city in Ukraine. And you hear that all the time. Why? Because Kyiv has patriots. And those people who were in Uzhhorod and Lviv outside, you know, who had moved to the west, they've all come back to Kyiv. So we see that, you know, through our companies, we have 26,000 people on the ground. And the companies where they'd temporarily relocated from Kyiv, you know, a few companies, 4,000 people, 2,000 people, all of them are back to Kyiv. So I guess what I'm saying is if we need more patriots. I mean, that's for sure. And that's a message that I do want to leave. If you look at agriculture, what we've seen, I mean, Ukraine, 28 billion in 2021 ag exports, right? With the grain corridor, over 1,000 ships were able to come out. That's 23 billion in 2022, despite the full-fledged invasion that Ukraine was able to export. You know, now we have a situation where those owners of port infrastructure have seen 7 waves of attacks of 30 to 40 drones. You know what? If you want to make sure that 400 million people get fed, put a Patriot or 2 in Odessa. That's really necessary. So, I mean, the other thing that I want to say, because we've talked about big projects, big business, but I also want to say about the role of small, medium-sized enterprises. This is a historic opportunity. This was something where across the country we talk about oligarchization and this concentration of interests. You know, 12, 15% was SMEs. In some countries, you have 70, 80% of the economic environment is SMEs. Ukraine has that historic opportunity. I can see Yaroslava Johnson, CEO of Western US Enterprise Fund, who's done so much over the years to support the development of SMEs. This is a historic opportunity. So let's not only look at the big projects and they're there. I mean, I think, does everyone in this room know that Ukraine has 1/3 of the lithium reserves in Europe? Probably not. Maybe not everyone knows that. A plug for our AmCham fact sheet, please take a look. These are really great facts, and we've got all kinds of interesting stuff in here. But not only big business, but look at the smaller businesses, look at SMEs, look at tech, which is driving resilience, which Stephanie, human capital. 310,000 programmers now, 310,000 programmers. The entire country, 19 million Ukrainians are on the DIA app. DIA City, which was launched in February, the month of the invasion, has 650 companies that have joined it. 7.3 billion industry. When Western started investing in tech, it was 110 million industry. It's 7.3 billion, and if Ministry of Digital Transformation keeps doing what they're doing, which is incredible, it will be 17 billion, which is their target in a few years. So I don't think you can get more human capital rich than, than leading in tech.
Building off the very strong educational base that Michael recommended. Interestingly, I was on a panel over the weekend where there's a group of scientists, neuroscientists at Georgetown looking at the effects of PTSD on children in Ukraine and how they can try to help them. So because of the air raid sirens. Agnes, I want to turn to you. How important is it in your role at DFC and the work that you're doing to try to, one, create jobs, but then maybe on a personal note, you're Polish. And when the wall came down, you went back to Poland, and maybe a little bit about what motivated you to do that.
Yeah, I do want to touch on this because I do agree with Lena that I think vast majority of Ukrainians will go back. But I think that they will need to have the types of conditions that enable further human capital growth, where so small businesses that are functioning, right? And in addition to Horizon, we also have a partnership with Bank Lviv where we are supporting working capital for small businesses so that retail stores can remain open. We're working with the Ukraine Catholic University where we provided assistance for them to develop a curriculum to include dealing with trauma and really working in a post-conflict region. So I think all of those things are incredibly important for Ukraine to be doing now to really enable the kinds of conditions that I found in Poland when I went back, right? Medical facilities. So I think that my experience has been that if you really have, if you can provide education for your kids, if you can go and buy food for your family without worrying about dying in a missile attack, I do think that once that happens, everyone will come back. I did, and I'm glad I did. Many of my Polish American friends did. Because we felt that this was not only a great chance for Poland, but it was a great opportunity for us. The growth was tremendous. And we do feel that with the growth that Ukraine is experiencing now, the growth once the war ends will, really skyrocket. And that's going to create opportunities that everyone will be looking for. And I do feel that the human capital will come back, but also a lot of human capital is still there. I think it's very, very important to underline.
Good. So I want to pivot just one more time because I would be remiss as the moderator of this panel not to really bring us back to a point that you raised earlier, Agnes, which is about and around transparency and corruption. And, it is the elephant in the room. There was a recent poll done of Ukrainians that said that 77% of the Ukrainians think that Zelensky has not done enough on the corruption front. And I find that a little worrying. There are 7 criteria that the Ukrainian government needs to meet by October to begin EU accession. They've met 2. So they've got 5 more to go, and they're pretty Herculean. So, Michael, let me start with you. You and I talked a lot about corruption. What's this going to take? Do you think they're getting corruption under control? And what do you think the role of the current oligarchs will be after the war?
Obviously, I'm not on the ground, so whatever I say, it's not person who lives there. But I hear same stories that, unfortunately, corruption's still there. And I know that some people get irritated when you talk about corruption, but reality is, for businesses particularly, is very important because if you transparency and corruption is synonyms, basically, same situation. So as a business, you want to make sure that if you do what you're supposed to do, you're going to get things done. And what sometimes when countries corrupt, then things just not get done, or you have to pay for things getting done, or somehow you got to find ways to get things done, which slow down the process. And particularly as an American business and other Western businesses, we just can't live with the corruption. So I think, in my opinion, Ukraine has unique opportunity, and with everything going on, to really rein on the corruption. And we hear everybody says, Secretary Pritzker said exactly that transparency. I mean, all these words that we talk in enablers. In my view, if Ukraine deal with corruption, they will solve more than 50% of the obstacles that people name and exist. So I think it's very clearly. And also, what corruption does, in many ways, just slow down things that we can afford. Like you just mentioned, we don't have 200 years to rebuild the country. So I think this is very important. Again, it's a controversial issue because people don't want to talk, they want to hear. But and particularly for projects that are long-term, and I represent energy, that you generally, and here's DFC, that they lend money for 20 years. You want to make sure that people get paid. And we want to do business in Ukraine without political risk insurance necessarily, because that would simplify the situation. So, I feel corruption is, if you would prioritize things, I would say it's number one, because it's enabler number one. If you don't talk country and don't mention that corruption is an obstacle, you're already halfway there.
Yeah, and it'll lower the cost of capital if we don't have to buy political risk insurance. So, Leanne, I want you to jump in here. The Ukrainians have done a lot. They have 5 anti-corruption bodies now. They're digitizing government services. Very little of that has appeared in the U.S. press. What's it like on the ground?
Well, thank you for asking me. Look, I think that there's a major communication problem. I'll say this, I'll start off with that, because the first thing I would be saying if I was a Ukrainian official is that for the first time in Ukraine's newly independent history, in March 2023, Ukraine was removed from the Council of Europe Greco blacklist for corruption because of what has been done in setting up the anti-corruption institutions, which is a huge thank you to the US, a huge thank you to UK and other G7 partners. So let's start with that, is that we do have to recognize that for the first time in its history, it has been removed, March 2023, and the institutions were built from scratch. Now they're operational. Now they have leaders. Now all eyes are upon them for delivering. And when we look at, we're facts people, we're stats people. We look at things like how many cases are open, how many investigated, how many prosecuted, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's what we have to point to. And when we look at, in the last year, if you look at 799 cases and 500 were open in the last year, it will gain traction. It's very important. What we see through AmCham is that where we see it is in far-flung regions, and where we see it are in some of the state-owned enterprises. And if that state-owned enterprise reform, which is underway, which again is very much thanks to G7, very much thanks to international financial institutions and bilateral partners, if that is taken care of, that is enormous. What we've done through AmCham, I think very good work, is to help set up an Office for Protection of Investor Rights. We understand that this is going to be a process. This anti-corruption infrastructure, for it to yield results, it's going to take time, it's going to be a process, and it's going to be messy. And we're going to see more and more cases because they're taking action. But you need some kind of interim measure. And that's why this Office for Protection of Investor Rights, its intent is, and this was an AmCham initiative, was to illuminate, was if there was something that one of our members was experiencing in a far-flung region, which is typically the case, then it can be brought and a spotlight put on it for the central government, for them to see what was happening. And I think that's very important. And if we look at over 50% of the cases have been addressed, and they're not addressed by like a decision. This is addressed by, having teams of prosecutors go through information, sit down with lawyers. It's a very cumbersome process, but it yields results. So, look, I think there's much to do. This will obviously be extremely important. The point about the president, he's being held accountable, and he understands that. I'm not sure that the survey was very much about, is he doing enough? It's more of, who do you hold accountable? And over 77% hold the president accountable for making sure that things happen on the corruption sphere. Through our companies, 26,000, and we stay out of politicized industries. We're in new generation, where we see the new generation is part of the global economy. They reject corruption. It's something they never want to see in their companies. They never want to see that in their transactions. So across our portfolio, whether it's retail or e-commerce or IT or light manufacturing, these are new generation-led companies who want access to private capital. They want to have lenders on board. They want to have DFC backing them, IFC, EBRD. They want to do IPOs. They understand that the only path to get there is to be transparent and open and full of integrity and honesty.
So building back better. Let me turn to you, Tomasz. You are Polish. You were in Poland during the EU accession, and when Poland queued up for EU accession, corruption was at the top of the list. And Poland's come a long way. What did the Ukrainians have to learn from Poland in that process? What did the Poles get right?
Stephanie, you're absolutely right. I was the same, it's like a flashback, 2004, 2005. I remember heated discussion in Dutch parliament where one party who was supporting Poland was talking about the graves of Polish soldiers in Netherlands, and the other one was saying that Poland had corruption, even worse than Russia. Of course, there was heated discussion. The president showed up and was going to explain that, first of all, you need to admit you're working on it. And that's Ukraine has done. Ukraine has set up a lot of good institutions. Now you see the results of those actions. Now you need to put positive spin on it, because from the Western boardrooms, it's kind of supports that there is corruption. That all those cases that come up, there is corruption. Yes, but you need to now show that we're fighting it, and we'll get there. Ukraine will get there the same way as Poland did through day-to-day work of eliminating corruption at the kind of low level, that you don't need to pay anybody to get a building permit, and if this situation persists, then it gets reported and gets dealt with through the corruption at the highest level. So positive spin, positive news that this is being dealt with, and don't accept that.
And digitization of services, which the Ukrainians are doing a lot of, within the government today, which is really good, because that kind of moves you up the curve. Yeah, Agnes, let me then turn to you. This important piece of U.S. government policy, and important for the investment choices that DFC makes. Do you think that your due diligence process is robust enough? Can you get at corruption? And how are you thinking about ultimately, investing in some of these SOEs and some of these companies that are coming out of a historic legacy?
Yeah, so we definitely take transparency and good governance very seriously. That is one of the top due diligence considerations for us and for any other investor. I think that this is very important in, for example, infrastructure, and will be really key for rebuilding of infrastructure, because that is a highly politicized sector, as you just mentioned, building permits and so on. But I think that Ukraine and President Zelensky should really, once again, be applauded for the steps that are being taken to take it head on and to actually address it. I think that gives many people more confidence that as they go in and try to place their capital or other resources, or get work permits for people that need to work there, that they won't face these obstacles, which increase the cost of capital as well, right? So it's not corruption, it's not just about, it's not illegal. It literally increases the cost of doing business and makes investors look at other places. So really, really fantastic to see all the reforms in Ukraine.
Yeah, Michael, I know you want to jump in, and I actually wanted to ask you a follow-on question at any rate, because you and I discussed this. We talked about building best infrastructure, not building cheapest infrastructure. So as kind of part of that, your answer, can you pull that out a little bit? We heard USTDA talking about it this morning.
Yeah, I just want to jump with you asked about oligarchs too, and I didn't say anything. And you asked why they wouldn't invest in Ukraine before. Because before the war, at least energy space was oligarch type of space. As you mentioned, infrastructure. So it's very important that going forward basis, it will be equal access to others. In other words, some will not get things done faster than others, some will not have more influence than others. So it's very important, that oligarchs, if they still exist there, they will not play
An outsized role.
An outsized role, because otherwise people will get frustrated and say, why would I deal with this? But the quality infrastructure, the quality, you have to, this is part of the program, you got to rebuild the country in the right way. Mm-hmm. And what's important for Ukraine, in my opinion, that we have not discussed, is create their own manufacturing base. A lot of things been destroyed. Ukraine, historically, at least when I lived in Ukraine in the Soviet days, Ukraine was the manufacturing base of Soviet Union. All the steel, the machinery, chemical industry, petrochemical. Ukraine was the industrial base of the Soviet Union. So I think in this part of rebuilding, when you rebuild the country, you need everything from cement up, this is not a high tech. You need brick and mortar, as people say, and steel. So you have to create its own manufacturing base. So in my view, when we talk about rebuilding Ukraine, we have to also talk about reindustrialization of Ukraine, building its own manufacturing facilities. I know we invest in projects, and if you look at projects, everything comes from abroad. Yeah. How can you rebuild the country if everything what's left here? So I think institutions have to look to fund manufacturing base. If you want to build solar, why don't we build a solar manufacturing facility? Whether it's wind, whether it's steel, whether it's other things. So I think manufacturing should be in a prime discussion here, because it's also create jobs. It cannot be service economy, it's got to be manufacturing economy. So in my opinion, this is very crucial.
It gets back to what you were saying about sector plans and then prioritization of those sectors, what comes first, what comes second. We have 15 minutes left. This is a very big audience, and I would love the opportunity to take questions from the audience. There's a mic in the back. You can queue up there, if you'd like to ask a question of the audience, of the panelists, please put your hand up and come up, introduce yourselves, and fire away.
Thank you, Wayne Easter from Canada. And I just want to back up what I was a member of Parliament for 28 years, and now we've formed a small company, and we're growing potatoes in Ukraine. We've been on the ground there. So I just want to say, agree with you how inspiring it is to be in Ukraine. More inspiring for me as a farmer is there's 6 feet of topsoil. But there is a real problem for small players in terms of financing. Mm-hmm. And I'll explain it this way. My wife said to me one day, she said, Wayne, how much money have we, emphasis on the we, got tied up in a crop in Ukraine? You do know the country's still at war and land we don't own. And so I think there's a real opportunity for small players like us. There's 4 of us working together, working with farmers in Ukraine. And the excitement of those people when they see a crop with modern technology, modern methods of farming in terms of the increased production and so on, their excitement is real. But how do you finance the smaller players? that are on the ground, that are probably greater risk, but are on the ground and rebuilding Ukraine better, if I could put it that way?
So that's a great question. And, you know, the Black Earth goes back and has fed the world since the Greeks and the Romans. But Agnes, let me turn to you and ask that question. How do we actually help the agribusiness sector maybe writ large in Ukraine, but the individual farmers? And then maybe one of you guys can take a crack at land reform and where the Ukrainian government is. Linda, that might be you. But Agnes, let's start with you.
Sure. So small businesses drive the economy, and I think it's everywhere. And I think it's really key that they have the right financing. So I mentioned Bank Lviv. We're getting ready to announce partnerships with additional local banks where we actually come in and guarantee large portions of their loans to the small businesses because they really cannot take on the risk on their own. Sometimes they don't have the liquidity to actually provide this type of capital. So working through intermediaries, simply because large investors really cannot go directly into these small businesses, but also working through intermediaries like Horizon that are providing the longer term capital, the more patient equity capital that is needed for growth. So I think we're trying to tackle it through helping those who can help provide the right kind of capital at the right time. And it's a process, and we are, I think the next few days we'll announce more investments in this sector.
Have you thought at all about specific ag facilities? Because financing, you know, farmers is a bit of a different business, from seeds to fertilizers to...
It is, right. So I think what you need to do is just make sure that you're partnering with people who understand the industry, right?
Okay.
Who are experts at how do you finance agriculture? Because I agree, it's a different type of, you don't just kind of wait for the loan to get repaid. You really have to understand what's happening ahead of it happening. Is the crop going to fail or not? And try to be able to refinance and address things. So, I mean, for us, it's really finding the right partners that are really industry experts and are on the ground to deliver the right kind of financing at the right time.
So Lynn, let me turn to you. I mean, one of the marathons really is going to have to be land reform. And how can we get to a place where you can amalgamate some of these plots, you know, into industrial-sized operations? Where is the government on that? And you know, is there anything the U.S. needs to be pushing on?
Yeah. Okay, so first I want to say that everything that you said in terms of the intermediaries is very important because you know, right now there's 579 program which Ukrainian businesses can access, which is World Bank grants and other grants that are then provided by banks throughout the country. The financial intermediaries, what's very important is for those like DFC, who is really not only just announcing that we're deploying or we're working with this bank, but they're pushing that bank to disperse. And that's, I think you're already on your next round of funding Bank Lviv, which is very important because nobody wants to see that these big, you know, we've announced 200 million, but then when you look at the disbursements, it's like 10 million, you know, I mean, so it's really up to those institutions, which you're doing successfully, to really push the banks that, look, take the risk, disperse it. It's extremely important that this be done in a very near term. But on land reform, I mean, obviously, you know, foreigners cannot buy land. There's a small size tickets that can be sold, but you know, of course, all of that is frozen right now. I mean, everyone's focused on the war. Land reform is not, you know, there is no talk within the parliament that this is a major issue that has to be dealt with right now in the midst of war. What is the major issue is that, you know, 30% of the arable land is mined. That's the demining is the issue that everyone's talking about, that you've got, you know, millions of mines that have been laid throughout the arable land, and how do you clear that? You know, obviously they're clearing the you know, for defense purposes, but for commercial purposes. When you already have that land, when it's, you don't even need land reform, but you have access to land that you can no longer use because it's mined and you're last in line as a commercial enterprise to have that land demined. So I think that's a great deal of efforts are you know, on the humanitarian demining. Farmland falls under humanitarian demining, you know. That falls under the Ministry of Economy. That's a very, very complex issue that folks are helping with in terms of state, in terms of, you know, Halo Trust, others. But at the end of the day, we need to accelerate that, and that's the most important thing to do in order to unlock the potential of the farmland.
This is where technology is going to have a huge advantage because they're using interesting drones to try to do this. Let me come back to Tomasz, but we have one more question back there, and then I'll come back to you. Go ahead.
My name is Jerry Hulton, and I run a firm called Global Futures Group, which works on issues of smart cities and urban technology around the world. But I want to ask a question about, there hasn't been much discussion about housing and rebuilding housing, which seems to me to be, first, a big need, and secondly, the kind of thing that American business could team up easily. It's the kind of thing that lots of small businesses do well, creates jobs, and it gets people a place to live when they come back. Am I missing something when I don't hear about housing, or is that ought to be on top of the list?
It's a great question. Agnes, when I was visiting you at the DFC the last time, we talked about housing finance and whether or not there wasn't an opportunity to do some kind of a debt for housing swap with the existing Ukrainian debt. You had some views, maybe you want to share those. And then Tomasz, let's turn to you because a lot of the Polish companies are thinking about housing. So,
Yeah.
Agnes?
No, we're actually investing all over the world in affordable housing. Affordable housing is key not only to rebuilding, but just to security and, like I said, to attracting people back to the country. So we're very much open to working with businesses that are interested. We do need to engage in when you actually have a business plan, when you're taking a concept down to a much more executable business plan, because we are a financier. But I think there are lots of other U.S. government and other agencies that are providing this assistance. Our sister agency, USAID, is on the ground and providing lots of assistance for creating business plans and bringing investable opportunities. There are many, the EBRD is doing quite a bit as well in that. So I do feel that there are lots of opportunities, and of course housing, we kind of call it social infrastructure, and infrastructure in general is going to be a key priority for everyone. Without infrastructure, you can't do business, so that should be a priority.
Yeah, and from my time at IFC, one of the things that we found in working in affordable housing is that you actually need to work on supply and demand. So you need a mortgage market, and then you need builders to actually build the housing. And so I see that as another really big opportunity for the development institutions to push on the creation of a mortgage market and a securitization of mortgages over time to help build the housing market in Ukraine, very much like what we did in the U.S. after the war. But Tomasz, it's mainly Polish contractors that are doing this work today, right?
Lining up, yeah. Preparing the trucks and cement companies to go to Ukraine, that's true. But that's so a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of sort of construction companies, especially in Poland, which now has high interest rates, so the mortgage market is a bit in a stagnation, so they're looking up to the east and willing to build affordable housing, the modular housing. They've been quite successful in Poland, but also in Czech Republic, Romania. So yes, they are moving. But as you said, you need a mortgage market, and with current level of interest rates, that's not really quite feasible now. So that program will be critical also to attract back human capital.
And are they building energy efficiency into the houses that you're seeing constructed? Because in the past, I mean, the amount of energy that was lost in the housing sector because of central heating in Ukraine was really substantive, like a third or something in that range, right?
Yeah, I think energy efficiency, we don't talk much because it's probably not a sexy talk, but I remember when I lived in Ukraine, because of central heating, did not work properly. Sometimes people fill their bathtubs with hot water to heat the house, which you can understand what it does with efficiency. So I think this is a huge area of potentially working in Ukraine on energy efficiency.
You have to either open your little fortichka and cool your apartment off, or hope that they turn the central heating on before it gets cold, right? But we are really out of time. I want to thank the panelists. This has been a very rich discussion, and if I take anything away, it's that there's opportunities on the ground today, and we need more American investment flowing into Ukraine starting tomorrow, and these people can help.